The After the Affair podcast with me, Luke Shillings, is here to help you process, decide, and move forward on purpose following infidelity. Together, we'll explore what's required to rebuild trust not only in yourself, but also with others. Whether you stay or leave, I can help. And no matter what your story, there will be something here for you. Let's go. Hello and welcome back to the After the Affair podcast. I'm your host, Luke Shillings, and today you're listening to episode number 196. I want to ask you a question today that maybe you've been avoiding, not because you're in denial, not because you're not paying attention, but because it's genuinely one of the most frightening questions you can ask yourself after betrayal. Here it is. What if they never change? Just sit with that for a second. Not the version of the question where you reassure yourself, but they will, they're trying, they've already changed in some ways. The actual question. What if the changes plateau here? What if this is as far as they can go? What if 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, you're still doing the same dance that you're doing today? What does that mean for you? If your stomach just tightened a little, I think you already know why this episode matters. Most betrayed partners I speak with are not naive. They are not blindly optimistic. They know, intellectually, that change isn't guaranteed. But there's a difference between knowing something intellectually and actually letting yourself feel the weight of it. And most people, understandably, avoid feeling the weight of it. Because underneath that hope that your partner will change is fear. A specific, very uncomfortable fear. The fear that they won't. And if they don't, what happens to everything that you've invested? What happens to the months of therapy, the hard conversations, the journaling, the sleepless nights spent trying to understand? The energy you've poured into reading about attachment styles, about trauma responses, about why people cheat. The version of the relationship you've been picturing on the other side of all of this work. If they never change, all of that has to mean something different than what you hoped it would mean. And that is terrifying. So instead of facing it directly, most people do something quieter. They keep hoping, because hoping feels better than facing the alternative. And there's nothing wrong with hope. Hope isn't the actual problem here. The problem is what hope can quietly turn into when it's the only thing holding the relationship together. Let me describe a pattern I see constantly in this work. In the early days after discovery, hope is healthy. It's even necessary. You need some belief that things can get better in order to do the work of staying and rebuilding. Nobody puts in the effort of recovery believing it's pointless. So hope, at the start, is fuel. But somewhere along the way, for many people, hope quietly shifts. It stops being fuel for the relationship and it starts being the thing keeping you tied to a specific outcome. You're no longer just hoping things improve, you're hoping for proof that the last however many months were worth it. You're hoping that their change will validate your decision to stay. You're hoping their transformation will confirm that you didn't waste your time. And this is where things get genuinely tricky, because the longer you wait, the more this shift intensifies. This is what's known in other contexts as the sunk cost fallacy. You've probably heard that term before. It's usually used to describe finishing a terrible meal because you've already paid for it, or staying in a bad film because you've already sat through half of it. The logic goes, I've already invested this much, so stopping now would mean that investment was wasted. Even though, rationally, the investment is already gone. Either way. Whether you finish the meal or not, you paid for it. Whether you stay for the rest of the film or not, you've already spent that time. The only real question left is, what do you want to do from this point forward? But that's not how the mind experiences it. The mind experiences continuing as protecting the investment and stopping as wasting it. This is exactly what happens in long recovery journeys after infidelity. The longer you wait for change, the more invested you become. Not just emotionally, although that's part of it, but time invested, energy invested, identity invested, because somewhere in there you've built a story about who you are. someone who didn't give up, someone who fought for their family, someone who chose to rebuild rather than walk away. And the prospect of they never change doesn't just threaten the relationship, it threatens the whole story. It raises the question, was all this for nothing? And so, to avoid having to face that question, many people, unconsciously, extend the timeline. Just a bit more time. Just one more attempt at the conversation. Just one more book, one more podcast, one more therapy session. Surely, if I just keep going, the change will come. Because the alternative, accepting that maybe it won't, feels like admitting that everything so far was wasted. And nobody wants to feel that their pain was for nothing. Here's where it gets even more layered, because there's a second trap hiding inside the first one. Once you've invested significant time hoping for their change, your sense of stability becomes dependent on something you don't control. Think about that for a second. You are the one doing an enormous amount of internal work. You're managing your own triggers, you're regulating your own nervous system, you're trying to rebuild trust in yourself. You're trying to figure out who you are in this new version of your life. And all of that effort, all of that genuinely difficult, important work gets quietly tied to a single external variable, whether they change. So your peace now becomes conditional, not on your own growth, but not on your own choices, but on someone else's internal process, their willingness, their capacity, their timeline. Which means you've handed the steering wheel of your own well-being to a person whose behaviour you cannot control. And I want to be really clear here, because I think it's a point that easily gets missed. This isn't a criticism of you for hoping that they'll change. It's not foolish to want your partner to grow. It's not naive to believe that people are capable of becoming better versions of themselves. The issue isn't the hope itself. The issue is what happens when your sense of safety, identity, and worth becomes entirely dependent on someone else's transformation. Because if that's where your stability lives, then every day you wake up without certainty about whether they'll change is a day that you wake up without certainty about your own life. That's an exhausting place to live. And it's also, quietly, a place that keeps you stuck. Because as long as your peace is downstream of their change, you will keep deferring your own healing. You'll keep telling yourself, I'll feel better once they change. I'll feel secure once they prove themselves. I'll feel like myself again once this is resolved. And in the meantime, your own healing, your own life, your own sense of self stays on hold, waiting for somebody else's permission to begin. So let's go back to the question I opened with. What if they never change? I'm not asking this to be cruel, and I'm not asking it because I believe that your partner won't or can't change. I have absolutely no idea whether they will or won't. Neither do you, fully, no matter how confident you feel either way. I'm asking it because the question itself is useful, regardless of the answer. Here's why. If you can sit with the possibility that they might never change and still find a way to feel grounded, then your stability was never actually dependent on their change in the first place. That is an enormous discovery, because it means that you can stop waiting. Not waiting in the sense of giving up on the relationship, waiting in the sense of putting your own life, your own peace, your own healing on pause until somebody else does something you can't control anyway. If, on the other hand, sitting with that question makes you feel like the flaw has disappeared, like there is no version of okay that doesn't include their transformation, that's important information too, because it tells you that right now your sense of safety is entirely external, and external safety is incredibly fragile. It depends on someone else's choices, someone else's growth, someone else's consistency, day after day, indefinitely. Nobody can sustain their well-being on a foundation like that forever. This is the part where I want to gently challenge something. A lot of people, when they hear, what if I never change, interpret it as a question about whether to stay or leave. But it's not. It's a different question entirely, and one only you can answer in your own time, with your own information. The question I'm asking is more fundamental than staying or leaving. It's this: can you build a life, a sense of self, a baseline of peace that exists independently of whether they ever fully become who you're hoping they'll become? Because if you can, you'll be able to make the staying or leaving decision from a much clearer place. Not from desperation, not from sunk cost, not from fear of having wasted your time, but from an honest assessment of what you actually want, made by someone who is already standing on solid ground. And if you can't yet, that's not failure. It's just simply where you are, and it points to the real work in front of you, which has very little to do with them at all anyway. So, what does it actually look like to build that ground? I want to offer a few shifts, not as a checklist, but as directions worth turning towards. The first is separating your healing from their behaviour. This sounds really simple, but it's genuinely one of the hardest shifts in this entire process. It means actively asking yourself, in any given week, what am I doing for my own regulation, my own growth, my own life, that has nothing to do with monitoring or waiting upon them? If the honest answer is not much, that's worth noticing without judgment. It just means the next step is clear. The second is grieving the version of the relationship that you'd hoped for, even while staying in the one that you have. This might be one of the most overlooked parts of recovery. You can be committed to working on the relationship and still need to grieve the fact that it may never look exactly the way that you had originally pictured. Grief and commitment are not opposites. You can hold both. And not allowing yourself to grieve often shows up later as resentment, or as an inability to register progress even when it happens, because you're still measuring the present against a fantasy that quietly didn't survive the betrayal. The third is redefining what "this was worth it" actually means. Right now, for many people, that phrase is tied entirely to outcome. This was worth it if they change. This was worth it if we make it. This was worth it if I get the relationship I wanted. But there's another way to measure it. How about this was worth it if I learned to regulate myself in chaos? Or this was worth it if I rebuilt trust in my own judgment? This was worth it if I figured out who I am outside of being someone's partner. Those things remain true regardless of what your partner does next. And they're available to you right now, not contingent on some future point where the uncertainty finally resolves. So, what if they never change? It's a hard question, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'd rather you sit with it honestly now than discover, years from now, that you spent that whole time waiting for permission to live. Permission that was always going to come from the wrong place. Your healing was never meant to be a reward for their transformation. It was meant to be yours, built by you, available to you regardless of what they choose to do with their own life. That doesn't mean you stop hoping. It doesn't mean you stop wanting the relationship to work. It means you stop needing it to work in order to be okay. And that distinction, as small as it sounds, changes everything about how you move through the rest of this. If this episode brought something up for you, particularly around how much of your peace right now is tied to somebody else's choices, I'd encourage you to sit with the questions I raised today rather than rushing past them. And if you want support working through this, it's exactly the kind of work I do in my one-to-one coaching and inside the After the Affair collective. You can find out more at lifecoachluke.com, or you can contact me directly on Instagram at mylifecoachluke. Until next time, please take care of yourself. I'll speak to you next week.